For this Shabbos, Parshas Vesechanan, I have once again some very fascinating thoughts to share with you. We begin at the beginning of the parasha. The parasha begins, Vesechanan el Hashem ba'esa hilemor. Moshe Rabbeinu says, I prayed, I implored to Hashem, ba'esa hilemor. At that time, Rashi says, we have it here, this is offering B. Rashi says, why does the Torah say ba'esahi at that time? Specifically, I davened at that time. So Rashi says, la'achar shekavashti eretz Sichon v'og. After Klal Yisrael had conquered the land of Sichon and Og, dimisi, it seemed to me, Rashi saying what Moshe Rabbeinu is thinking, dimisi shema hutar haneder. Maybe the vow that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took against Moshe Rabbeinu entering Eretz Yisrael, Hutar HaNeder, might have been rescinded. And therefore, since Moshe Rabbeinu felt that now that they conquered Eretz Sichon and Og, and that would be the land that was given to Shevet Gad, Ruvain, and Chatzi Menashe, so it technically was part of Eretz Yisrael. And that's what it means, ba'esahi. What does it mean at that time, once again? That Moshe thought that maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu was relenting, and that the vow that Hashem took that he not enter Eretz Yisrael might have been rescinded. And obviously, we know that that wasn't true, and that the neder, that the vow, that the shvua really that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took, applied only to Eretz Yisrael proper on the other side of the Yarden. But that's what the Torah says, ba'esa hilemor. The Medrash tells us on this pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu not only davened, but he davened multiple tefillos. The Medrash says, how do we know that Moshe Rabbeinu davened and implored HaKadosh Baruch Hu and prayed and literally begged to go into Eretz Yisrael? And how many times did he make that tefillah? He did it 515 times. Shenema, as the pasuk says, the Medrash tells us, Vesechanan el Hashem ba'esahi lemor, and Vesechanan begematria hachehave. And that is the gematria of the Vesechanan, the word Vesechanan, vav, aleph, taf, ches, nun, and nun add up to 515. So Vesechanan, I daven 515 tefillos at this time, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to see maybe the neder would have been rescinded. The Vesechanan, excuse me, the Vesechanan also on this pasuk says, Shispalel Moshe Tuf Kuf Tesvav, that's 515 tefillos, Kaminyan Vesechanan. There's a famous thought that is written by the Pnei Yoshua, who is not known for his commentary on Chumash, who's known for his commentary on Shas, specifically defending Rashi and explaining many Rashis all throughout the Talmud. And he has a fascinating point on this idea found in Maseches Brachos, and he says as follows. Let's look it over here, and it's from, again, the Pnei Yoshua. We begin at line 1. Mad'isa b'medrash pliya shespal Moshe tafkuf tesvav tfilos kaminyan Vesechanan. Hupela, it's a very interesting 515 tefillos. Is that an exaggeration that he actually davened 515 tefillos, or it just says, he was constantly davening? Ma boilu lamdeinu, what is it coming to teach us? Venerally, says the Pnei Yeshua, I have the following thought. My opinion. He says, I don't think, even though we see the Medrash says and the Vesechanan says that they're learning out from the gematria of Vesechanan. And he says, I don't really think that that's in fact really the pshat. He says, Husha spal Moshe Tavkuv Tfilos becheshbon mechuvon v'drasha devaskan asmachta ba'alma. It's just a nice thought. V'hainu lefima disa b'medrash perish Rashi b'chumash pasha v'schanon al Hashem ba'esahi perish Rashi la'achar shakavash eretz Sichon v'og Omar dimisi shem mahuter aneder. He says, I want to tell you, I think that the main idea here is on the fact that it was that the pasuk says bo'esahi, and as we explained earlier, Rashi says it was specific at this time after Sichon and Og were conquered, that their territories were conquered. That's when Moshe started davening. Okay, so before the conquering of Sichon and Og, Moshe Rabbeinu did not daven and ask to go into Eretz Yisrael. And he took an oath, and that's what it was. But only after Sichon and Og were conquered did Moshe Rabbeinu even have a havamina that maybe I should ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu, maybe we should think about, maybe the neder was rescinded. That only happened after the conquering of Sichon and Og. You look back in last week's parsha, you see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe, Re'eh, look, pasuk in last week's parsha, Re'eh nasati biyadchas et Sichon melech Heshbon ha'mori ves artzo echel rosh, hayom hazeh echel teis. He says, I gave it to you. Now that land is part of you, and you should start inhabiting it. Look that up in last week's parsha. V'yesh b'medrash b'perish Rashi b'chumash she kofar sar shel amorin shel mamala tachas raglav shel Moshe. And the Medrash says, and Rashi tells us also that Moshe Rabbeinu saw that they would be totally annihilated. The sar, the angel of Sichon, was crushed by Moshe Rabbeinu, etc. So you see that this is now the opportunity, the period that's happening, that they are absolutely coming, that Moshe and Klal Yisrael is coming to conquer the land. Nimtza de Lefiza, so says the Pnei Yoshua here on 9/11. May also yom ve'elech. From that day, from the day that Eretz Sichon and Og were conquered, ve'elech haya pischon pela Moshe l'spal. Now Moshe has the thought, the idea, the opportunity that he wants to make to see if he actually could go across the Jordan River to Eretz Yisrael. V'lomar shem hutar aneder. V'diber zeh b'chol parsha zu haya b'tesvav ba'av. K'disa b'perek yesh nochlin daf kuf chaf aleph. Says the Pnei Yoshua, based on the Gemara in Bava Basra, daf kuf nun aleph, that this occurred when the conquering of Sichon and Og, and that whole story happened when on Tu B'Av, which Mirz Hashem we will commemorate this coming week, coincidentally. Haya b'Tu B'Av, as the Gemara tells us, the Hainu b'Yom Shakolu Bo Mesei Midbar, Tichsiv Ahi Kasher Tamu Ayin Sham Perish Rashi v'Tosvos Barichos. That we all know that that the Gemara tells us that one of the reasons we celebrate Tu B'Av is that was when Klal Yisrael realized that the Gzeira for the 40 years, the death in the Midbar, and everybody who left Mitzrayim died during the 40-year sojourn in the desert, so that was over on Tu B'Av. They realized, they saw the full moon, they realized that it was now the 40th year, and that was all over. And that's when they started conquering Sichon and Og. So, therefore, what? Im Kain, says the Pnei Yoshua beautifully. Seva chashov min tu ba'av et zayin ba'adar yom shemes bo Moshe. If you figure out and he did the math. If you figure out from Tu B'Av until Moshe Rabbeinu dies, the 40th year, Tu B'Av, until the following Zion Adar, when that's Moshe Rabbeinu's Ptira, Moshe will die. Okay, and you figure out the months in their proper order. Echad mole ve'echad chaser. As we know, one has 29 days, one has 30 days, etc. So you have the month of Av, okay, which has 30 days. You have Elul, which has 29 days. You have Tishrei, which has 30. You have Mar Cheshvan, which has 29. You have Kislev, which has 30. You have Teves, which has 29. You have Shvat, which has 30. Okay, so you figure it out based on that pattern. Look what he's going to say here. Okay, again. Say v'chashov min tu ba'av ad zayin ba'ada yom shemes b'moshe kitachshov hachadashim al seder. When you figure out the months in order, echad mali ve'echad chaser, 1 30 days, 1 29 days. Ole, you figure it out and do the math as he did. Masayim yom, it's 200 days. Daled malayim v'daled chaserim. You have 4 months that have 30 days and 3 months that have 29 days. V'od zayin yomim, and then there's another 7 days in Adar. So you have Tu B'Av, 15 days. You have Elul, which has, as we said before, 29. You have Mar Cheshvan, Kislev, Teves, Shvat, and then Adar, which has 7 days. In those 200 days, 200 plus days, Moshe Rabbeinu davened 3 times a day. Shachris, Mincha, Meir. Haya, tough reish tfilos. That's 600 tfilos. 3 times 200, he figures out it's 200 days, and that would be 600 tfilos. Rak sheyadua shebeshabbos ein hayochid shel tzrachav. So Moshe Rabbeinu was asking for his own personal request, but we know we don't ask personal requests on Shabbos. Okay, imkain kishatasir chavches shabbosos shobayosa yamim. We subtract the 28 shabbosos from those days that were between Tu B'Av and Zayin Adar. Kishatachzir chavches shabbos shori ba'osan yamim shal reis yom nishar kufaf ayin beis yamim. He is left with 172 days. Gimel tfilos b'chol yom, 3 times 172. Harei taf kuf yud vav. That's 516. 516 tfilos. If you figure that out, subtract the shabbosos, and that's how many tfilos Moshe Rabbeinu in his personal tfilah said over that period, 516 tfilos. Wait a minute. However, shatchilas tu ba'atzmo, kevan shelo hayadibur misyached b'yom el Moshe el bayom v'lo b'layla. Moshe Rabbeinu only spoke to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the day and not at night. So that night before, when Tu B'Av began at Ma'ariv, he didn't do the personal request yet. He only started in the morning because that's when he realized that now he could ask, right? Now that Sichon and Og was conquered. So, Harei Lecha Cheshbon Mechuvan. So it's not, it's 3 tefillos every day with the exception of the first day. And that day was, that's why we get to the cheshbon of 515 tefillos. Harei lecha cheshbon mechuvan. It's exact. The tough kuf tesvav tefillos is follow Moshe me'os hayom tu ba'av ad yom moso. And so it's 515 tefillos Moshe Rabbeinu davened from Tu B'Av until the day of his death. Zayin B'Adar Shemesbo b'shas mincha. He died in the afternoon, as Chazal tell us. Kedisa b'midrash. Kein nira li nachal. That to me is the pshat. That is what the Pnei Yoshua says when we see the Vesechanan. It's not the Gematria, that's a nice remez, but he proved that it was exactly 515 tefillos, because that's how many days came from the period that Moshe Rabbeinu realized that maybe the neder was rescinded until his death, 515 tefillos. He concludes by saying, Drush Halesi, he said, I once gave a drush, Shezeh Perish HaPasuk, Rav Lach Al Tovas Daber Elai Od, where it says, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, enough, don't speak to me anymore about it. She'ilu Esval Moshe Ol Tfilacha, Shem Taf Kuf Yud Vav, Va'ola Vav Pamim K'minyan Elokim, if it would be 516, which would be 6 times Elokim. Elokim is Haya Mantik Bezeh Vav Bate Dinim Harum Perak Bam Beima Vaya Nan B'Tfilaso, based on different ideas that he would have awakened the Beis Din in Shamayim, and therefore that might have had a different effect. And then his tefillah would have been answered. He said, don't add anymore. Beautiful thought from the Pnei Yoshua. A little later on in the parsha, we have the idea of Bal Tosif, of adding on to mitzvos. The Torah says here, Lo Sosifu Al Hadavar Shanochi Mitzvah Eschem V'Lo Sigru Mimenu Lishmor Es Mitzvos Hashem Elokechem Asher Anochi Mitzvah Eschem Lo Sosifu Al Hadavar. You shall not add unto the word Asher Anochi Mitzvah Eschem, that I command you, V'Lo Sigru Mimenu, and do not subtract from it. Lishmor Es Mitzvos Hashem Elokechem Asher Anochi Mitzvah Eschem, to observe the mitzvos of Hashem your God that I command you. Rashi says, Lo Sosifu, what does it mean not to add on to the mitzvos? Rashi says it means, Kigon, for example, Chamesh Parshios Tefillin, Chamesh Parshios B'Tefillin. How would we add on to the mitzvos? Instead of having 4 Parshios in Tefillin, we're going to add another one, and that would make 6 Parshios in Tefillin. Or Chameshes Minim Belulav. Instead of the Arba Minim, we would have 5. Chamesh Tzitzas. Instead of the 4 corners in a garment, we would have 5. V'chein, and similarly, Lo Sigru. We do not subtract from the mitzvos. 3 Parshas and Tefillin, or 3 Minim, or 3 Tzitzas. Interestingly, in Parshas Re'eh, we'll read it in a couple of weeks, this mitzvah is apparently repeated. Pasuk says, here it is, it's G on the sheet, Kol hadavar asher anochi mitzvah eschem osos u'shmor u'lasos, the entire matter that I command you, you shall guard it to do it. Lo sosef alav v'lo sigru mimenu. You shall not add to it, and you should not subtract from it. Rashi here says very similarly, Lo sosef alav chamesh totafos, 5 sections of your tefillin, chamisha minim belulav, 5 sections in the lulav, and arba brachos bebirchas kohanim, and 4 brachos in the birchas kohanim. The Mefarshim discuss why Moshe Rabbeinu did not, why Rashi did not say Birchas Kohanim in Parshas of Vesechanan. He does in Parshas Re'eh. Maybe we'll talk about that when we get to Parshas Re'eh. So Rashi tells us that changing the fundamental mitzvah is what the Torah is telling us in Lo Sosifu. In other words, you have a mitzvah that has 4 minim, let's say lulav and esrog, don't make it 5, don't make it 6, don't make it 3 to add or subtract to the mitzvah. Don't change the fundamental concept of the mitzvah. The Ramban says that and then adds another part to it. He says, L'fi dati, in my opinion, says the Ramban, in Parshas Vesechanan, Perek Dalet Pasuk Beis, Afilu Bada Lazos Mitzvah Pnei Atzma, even if he invents in his mind to make up a new mitzvah, Kagon She'asa Chag B'Chodesh Shabada Milibo, he makes up a holiday, invents a holiday, as we see Yeravim ben Nevat did when he built the Avodah Zarah in Navi Malachim. He made up his own Yontif. That's Lo Sosifu. You're adding on to the mitzvah of the Torah over Balav. But Kachamru Mikra Megillah, and that's what the Gemara tells us in Maseches Megillah. Meya Shmonim Neviim Amdu Lahem Yisrael. Different girsos. It says 48 in our girsa in the Gemara. Here he has Meya Shmonim 180. How again the Mefarshim discuss why the Ramban said 180. Amdu Lahem Yisrael Lo Pachsu Lo Sivu Mashakasu B'Torah. They didn't add or subtract what is written in the Torah, except for Mikra Megillah. How could they do them? I Darish. And the Gemara says they learned it out that it's really not an addition to the Torah. There's a remez in the Torah that we should have Megillah Esther and Purim as a commemoration of the destruction of Amalek. So how do Chachamim have the ability to make mitzvah? So the Ramban says it's not a mitzvah. It is basically a guard, a fence around the Torah, and the Torah gives the Chachamim permission to put a mishmeres, a geder, around the Torah, and that is not considered adding on to the mitzvah. So you have, Rashi says, what's the definition of lo sosifu? It is changing the fundamental mitzvah in the Torah, and the Ramban says it's inventing new mitzvahs, making new mitzvahs, or subtracting mitzvahs. The Vilna Gaon looks at both these psukim in Parshas Vesechanan in this week's parsha and in Parshas Re'eh, and he says, take a look at the context of the pasuk. We look at the context of the pasuk, we'll see exactly what each pasuk is referring to. And that's here found in the Kol Aliyah. He says, Eis kol hadavar shanochi mitzave eschem osos shmor lasos, lo soseifu lo sigra mimenu. That is actually the pasuk in Parshas Re'eh. V'kashet. But back in Parshas Vesechanan, our parsha of this week, it says Lo Sosifu Lo Sigru. So what's the Torah repeating? It says it once in this week's parsha. It says it in Parshas Re'eh. What's the Torah coming to add? What's the difference of these two parshios? V'yesh lomar. Shasham over there, which is really over here in our parsha this week, in the parsha of Vesechanan, hakavana lebalahosif mitzvahs chadoshim al minyan hataryag mitzvahs. Says the Vilna Gaon, you know what the parsha means in this week's parsha? It's like the Ramban. It's like the Ramban adding new mitzvahs to the 613 mitzvahs, inventing new mitzvahs. The Khan, and here in Parshas Re'eh, what we'll read again in a couple of weeks, al mitzvahs atzman l'kayim b'li tosefes v'giron. And here in Parshas Re'eh, that pasuk is talking about the mitzvah itself, not to change the mitzvah fundamentally, either by subtracting or adding on to the mitzvah. Kagon, gimel tzitzios, oloniach bezugos tefillin, or putting on 2 pair of tefillin, etc. Ulitol bez lulavim biyado b'chag, or maybe take 2 lulavim instead of 1 lulav, you take 2. The Kohen lo yigrav lo yosif, and the Kohen should not subtract from the birchas kohanim or add his own bracha, afilu dibur echad al birchas kohanim. And he says, how do I know that that's the pshat? That in Parshas Vesechanan, it's to invent new mitzvos, and in Parshas Re'eh, it's to change the mitzvah. Zeshakasav eis kol adavar tishmeru lasos kefi tzivui lo sosef olav lo sigra mimenu. If you take a look at the pasuk, he says, look at the context. Here, let's look over here in G. It's Eis Kol Hadavar Asher Anochi Mitzvah Eschem. That I'm commanding you to do, the mitzvah that I'm commanding you to do, also it's in singular. Also Sishmeru Lasos, that mitzvah you should do. Also say for level of Sigrimenu. Don't add to it and don't subtract from it, from the mitzvah. Don't change the fundamental mitzvah and say that the mitzvah has, again, tefillin has 5 or 3, or tzitzis 5 or 3, etc. That's what it says in Parshas Re'eh. in Parshas Vesechanan, in our parsha, is talking about fundamentally, it's talking about adding a new mitzvah to the Torah, or subtracting, and that's in plural. Lo sosifo adavar shanochi mitzav eskam lo sig mimeno lishmor es mitzvos Hashem Elokeichem. We have 613 mitzvos. We don't have 612. We don't have 614. We have 613. And don't add to that. So the Vilna Gaon says, I'm taking Rashi, I'm taking the Ramban, and I'm showing you that the pasuk in Parshas Vesechanan is talking about adding on or subtracting mitzvahs to the Torah, and the pasuk of Parshas Re'eh is talking about fundamentally changing the mitzvah in and of itself, and that is the Vilna Gaon on that idea. In Perek Daled, pasuk Chaf Gimel, the Torah says, fascinating pasuk. The Torah says, that Perek Daled pasuk Chaf Gimel. Yes, the Torah says, I'll read the entire pasuk. You only have half the pasuk on the sheet. It says, Hishamru lachem. You should be very careful. Hishamru lachem. You should be aware. Pen tishkechu es bris Hashem Elokeichem. Lest you forget the bris, the covenant of Hashem Elokeichem, asher karasi machem, that He made with you. And so don't forget the bris, the agreement that you made with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what would you do? Vasisem lachem pesel tamunas kol, and you make yourself a pesel, a graven image, or a likeness of anything. Asher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, that Hashem, your God, has commanded you. So, again, look at the pasuk. Va'asisem lachem pesel, and you will make a pesel, tmunas kol, a image, a likeness of anything, asher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, that which Hashem your God has commanded you. Says Rashi, what does it mean, asher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, which Hashem your God has commanded you? Says Rashi, Perish Rashi, he says, asher tzivcha shelo lasos, that He has commanded you not to make. The pasuk says, as Hashem has commanded you. But what does that mean? Rashi explains that the pasuk is that I shouldn't make idols. I shouldn't make a pesel. And therefore, that's how Rashi has to understand it. Despite the fact that the pasuk says, Chol asher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, it means what I commanded you not to do. The Kotzker of Menachem Mendel Morgenstern, which I spelled wrong, it should say Stern, S-T-E-R-N, in a sefer that many of his thoughts are quoted, called Amud Emes, says the following very beautiful thought. He says, I mean, the pasuk, look at it literally. It should say, and you make an idol, an image, a likeness, which Hashem did not command you to do. You're not allowed to do it. Rak, pesel tmuna, so he says, I'm going to tell you the pshat. The pshat is as follows. Pesel utmuna, an idol or a form, an image, and a tmuna and a likeness, hutziur utamunas hadavar. It's not the actual item. It is a picture, it is a likeness, it is an image of something else. Ve'eno etzem hadavar mamash. The picture, the likeness is not the actual item. It is just a picture of it, an image of it. His Hira Torah, so says the Kotzker, the Torah here is coming to warn us. Nishmor atzmeinu milasos. We have to guard ourselves from doing what? From milasos min asher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha pesel utmuna. From Hashem commanded us from making a likeness, an idol, a picture. Shemitzvos Hashem lo yeka golam eitz ve'evan b'li ruach chayim. That when we do mitzvos, we shouldn't do mitzvos because They are a likeness or an image of the mitzvah that we should be doing. Lahayir shebeim tiyeh avodas ha'adam b'li hakavana haritzuya hu teov gadol be'enei Hashem kamo pesel tmuna shel avodah zarah mamish. When we do a mitzvah, when Hashem commands us to do a mitzvah, we should do the real thing. Don't go through the motions. Don't do a picture of what you should do. Don't do a likeness or an image. The picture, the likeness, the image, the idol is a fake. It's a recreation of something that's real. Says the Kutzker in a beautiful idea. That's what it means here. If you do everything that Hashem commands you and you're only doing it like a likeness, like an image, like a recreation, but it's really not the real thing, that's not what Hashem wants from you. Hashem wants the real thing from you. Hashem wants you to do the right thing properly, not an image, a likeness, a recreation, a picture of what you really should be doing. Now we come to an absolutely magnificent thought from Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. In Parshas Vesechanan, as you all know, is the Aseres Adibros. And in the Aseres Adibros of Parshas Vesechanan, it says, Shamor es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadasho. The first version of the Luchos that we have, the first version of the Aseres Adibros that we have in Parshas Yisro, we lane in Parshas Yisro, we lane it on Shavuos. It says Zochar es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadasho. But the version of the Aseres Adibros here in Parshas Vesechanan that Moshe Rabbeinu is repeating says Shomor es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadasho. And this is what Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky is going to tackle for us now. And he says, Shomor es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadasho. Perish Rashi's Vesechanan. Rashi writes, and this is a quote of Rashi, Uberishonos Omer Zochar. And in the first of the Aseres Adibros in Parshas Yisro, it says Zachar. And as we know, Shneim b'dibar echad u'b'teva achas nemru u'b'shmiya achas nishma'u. As you know, that in the first version of the Aseres Adibros, it says Zachar. Both words were said in the same utterance as a single word, and they were heard as a single hearing. We all know that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu miraculously said the Aseres Adibros, Zochar and Shomar were said simultaneously, and everybody heard both words simultaneously. Ad kan Lashono, that's a quote of Rashi, and we all know that from L'Chadodi, Shomar v'Zochar b'dibar echad. Okay, says Rav Yaakov, Hine, Inyan Zeton Be'er. Let's understand this idea about the simultaneous utterance of Zachar and Shomar. It has to be that might have been orally that Zachar and Shomar were said at one time. But what was written on the luchos? Was it Zachar or was it Shomar? Klomar, O Zachar or Shomar. How do we say that? Why do we have to say that? Says Rav Yaakov, Darei Sefer Torah shenichtav bo Zachar Shomar b'makam echad yesov Sefer Torah pasol. If you wrote both words, Zachar v'Shomar, in the Aseres Adibros to Sefer Torah pasol, you either got to write. You have to write Shomar in Vesechanan. You have to write Zachar in Yisro. But if you'd write both, it would be a Sefer Torah pasol. In Kain aleinu lahavin heicha yanichtav meluchos. So what? How was it written? I understand how it was said, but how was it written? There are those who want to say, Shabaluchos are Rishonos. Remember, we had two sets of luchos. We had the luchos that were initially brought down by Moshe Rabbeinu, which he subsequently broke when they were worshiping the Egel, and then he got the second set of luchos. So maybe you're going to say, Haya makom loma shabaluchos are Rishonos because of Zachar. Ubeluchos Ashnias Hayakos of Shamar, Das Ezukan Monim, and maybe that's the opinion of certain Rishonim. Aval EF Shalomakin Badas Rashi. But I can't, but that might be a feasible opinion in some, for some of the Rishonim to say, but you can't say that based on Rashi, because Rashi says in Sanhedrin, Dafman Vav Amud Beis, because of Rashi, V'zel Shona, Rashi writes as follows. Halekala Meimar, there the Gemara is talking about what mitzvos were Klal Yisrael commanded in Mara, which was one of the first stops they made after Yetzias Mitzrayim. Before they got to Har Sinai, the Torah says they were commanded certain mitzvos in Mara. And then the Gemara discusses what mitzvos they were commanded. And there Rashi writes, Halek lamema de Moshe have amar luhu ba'arbas moav kasher tzivcha b'Sinai de Moshe lav me'elav ha'yeshona le'mishnah Torah u'mashiram ha'mitzvoseh ela k'moshe kabbalahu ha'yachozer magidlam v'chol ma shekazav b'tibasar chonas ha'yakazav b'luchos v'chein shama b'Sinai kam l'shono. Rashi says in Sanhedrin that when Moshe Rabbeinu says in the Aseres Adibros kasher tzivcha b'Sinai, as it says in, for example, in this pasuk here in Parshas Vesechanan, Shomor es Yom HaShabbos l'kadsho kasher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, as Hashem commanded you. Okay, and as Rashi says here in Parshas Vesechanan, kasher tzivcha kodem matan Torah b'Mara, it happened in Mara. So Rashi's telling us that Moshe is not making up something. Moshe is saying over what he said originally. Again, Lav me'elav ha'yeshona le'mishnah Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu is not inventing words. Moshe Rabbeinu is saying what he heard originally. U'mashiram ha'mitzvoseh k'moshe kabbalahu ha'yachozer. As he received them, that's what he's telling. Umagilam, that's how Rashi understands it. And what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying over as the Aseres Adibros is what he heard, and that's what he's writing over. That's what Rashi says in Masechah Sanhedrin. So Rashi must hold that the Luchos Rishonos and Shnios were exactly the same. Again, there might be others that disagree with this, but this is Rashi's opinion based on what Rashi writes here in Masechet Sanhedrin, that what Rashi is, what Moshe Rabbeinu says, Kasher Tzivcha Hashem, that's what he heard. And therefore, once that's what he heard, then that is what was written on the Luchos originally. Avo, Nirula Anias Daiti, says Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, I'm going to tell you the pshat. Beautiful thought. Only one of them was written in the Luchos. It was either Zachar or Shamar. Obviously, which one was written? Umasha Huska Parshas Yisro Zachar or Parshas Vesechanan Shamar. Hainu. So why is there a distinction between the Parsha of Vesechanan that we're reading this Shabbos and Parshas Yisro that we read before and on Shavuos? Ishum shebeluchos hayaharbe tevos begeter kriyan v'lo ksivan o ksivan v'lo kriyan. You all know that there's a concept of a kriyan ksiv. What's a kriyan ksiv? Since there are no nakudos in the Torah, there are words that are written one way and pronounced another way. A kri, it's read one way and it's written another way. There's certain words that are totally written one way and pronounced totally different. In Parshas Kisavo, we'll have it in a few weeks. In the Tochacha, there are a couple of words which are totally different, but we know through our Masorah, we read it a certain way. Okay, there's a Kriyan Ksiv. We've had Kriyan Ksiv many times. Says Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, that's the pshat here in the Aseres Hadibros, that there are words that are written and they're pronounced a different way. V'hainu she'efsher she'teva shamar hayaksiv. It could be that the way, what was engraved in the Luchos, which word was written on the Luchos, was Shomar. Vakri haya zachar, or lahefech. or the opposite. So the two words, Zachar and Shamar, one was the way it was written, and one was the way it was pronounced. Haya Shateva Shamar Eksiva Kriya Zachar Leva. The Zapshat Shabedibur Echad Namru. And that's what it means that Zachar Shamar Bedibur Echad. Hainu She'echad Hayaksiv Babeza Yakri. One was the way it was written, one was the way it was pronounced. Uktsas Raya, and then he says something fascinating. He says, okay, so we know it was a Kri Niksiv, so it was written one way and pronounced another way. So actually, which one was written and which one was pronounced? He says, I think it was written Shamar and it was pronounced Zachar. And what's my proof? Shmon Esrei on Shabbos morning, the Amida of Shabbos morning. Uktsas Raya yesh lahavi sheshamar hoya zeh shenichtav mimasha anu omrim betfila shachar shel Shabbos. What do we say in Shabbos morning in the Shmon Esrei in the Amida? Yismach Moshe b'matnas chelko. Moshe should be happy with his portion. Ushnei luchos avan her biyado. And he brought two luchos down in his hand, the chasav bahem, and what's written in the luchos? Shmiras Shabbos, the Shmira of Shabbos. It's written v'shamru. Shamar is b'nei. Shamar is Yom HaShabbos l'kadsho. So he says maybe that's a raya. That was written, but how it was pronounced was Zachar. Now we understand what Rashi meant in Sanhedrin. What does Rashi mean when he says everything that was what we find in the Luchos Hachronos? I'm sorry, in the Dibros Hachronos, we find here in Parshas Vesechanan and Haya Kazav Beluchos v'chein Shama b'Sinai, and we heard that on Sinai. If you look carefully with what we reading this Shabbos, the Aseres HaDibros this Shabbos, and the Aseres HaDibros in Yisro, there are more differences than just Zachar and Shamar. There are other very subtle, interesting differences. Okay, we see by just reading the psukim, there are differences. How could Rashi write there's no difference between the first set of the first Parshas Yisro and Parshas Vesechanan? But based on what I'm saying, now it makes sense. For example, take the words that we quoted before. Asher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha. That's the pasuk. Shamar is Yom HaShabbos L'kadsho. Kasher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha. Shemavur b'sug Yisham, as Rashi explained from that Gemara in Sanhedrin. Shem nemru b'Sinai. They were said on Har Sinai. Afal pi she'enam ksuvim Parshas Yisro. And you don't see those words. Asher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha in Parshas Yisro. V'hainu shemishum shetevas Elohaya b'kerek ksivan v'lo kriyan or kriyan v'lo ksivan. Because one was the Kri and one was the Ksiv. So the way it was written is one, and the way it's pronounced is the other one. Obviously, when it says Asher Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha is referring to what happened in Mara prior to Matan Torah, and that's all the distinctions between the Dibros Rishonos and Achronos, and that is the idea of the Kri and Ksiv. Rabbi Yaakov goes on here and tries to explain, explains the Gemara in Bava Kama, but due to our time constraints, everyone is more than welcome to download the sheet here and look it up, and how it explains how it follows on in another Gemara in Bava Kama, where he explains the difference between the Luchos Rishonos and Luchos Achronos. Two more quick ideas for this week's parasha. We see, we read on Tisha B'Av the pasuk of Kisolid Banim. So the pasuk is as follows. Pasuk says, Kisolid Banu v'nei Banim, when you will have children and grandchildren, v'noshantem ba'aretz, and you will v'noshantem ba'aretz. So Art Scroll translates v'noshantem ba'aretz as, and you will have been long in the land. And what will happen after you've been long in the land? V'ishchatem, you will grow corrupt. Va'asisem pesel temunas kol, and you'll make a carved image of the likeness of anything. Va'asisem hara b'nei Hashem Elokecha lachiso, then you will do evil in the eyes of Hashem your God to anger him. V'noshantem, you will have been long. And what is the idea? What does that mean? That you'll start doing the wrong thing. Says Rav Hirsch, beautiful idea, which I think is very, very relevant to our time. Rav Hirsch writes, Kisolid, not immediately at their entrance into the land does Moshe fear the danger of aberration, but he sees it coming the longer they are in the land. Sees it coming only when the second and third generation will have been born in the land. V'noshantem ba'aretz, and they will have become old in the land. Yashan is not like Zakein, the opposite of young, but the opposite of new, afresh, as indeed already lies in the conceptions of dark and sleep, which are also designated by Yashan or Yashain, which means to sleep. Only when the nation will have had 2 or 3 generations behind it, born in the land, will its inhabitants consider themselves as natives, originated from the land. The time when they had no home, no land belonging to them will have passed from their minds, and they will entirely have forgotten their origin and whom they have to thank for the land and for their being permitted to remain in it. After they're there a couple of generations, they'll take the land for granted already. These Jews that are coming into the land were probably born in the Midbar, or maybe if they're older, they were born in Mitzrayim. They were under 20, they could see us Mitzrayim. They understand what it comes in, what the land of Eretz Yisrael is. But once you were born there and you grew up there and this is your homeland, this is, where do I go for vacation? I want to go someplace else because I've grown old from it. It's old hack. It's nothing new. We, Baruch Hashem, have Eretz Yisrael for 70 plus years now. It's old hack. That's not the idea. We never should always be special in our minds. Says Rav Hirsch, not for naught has God with his Leman Tizkoros Yom Tzeischa Me'eretz Mitzrayim Kol Yimei Chayecha. Remember that we left Mitzrayim all the days of your life. Interwoven the fact of the redemption from Egypt daily into our minds to be ever freshly remembered. Not for naught founded his festivals and his great institutions of Shemitah and Yovel for the ever-recurring acts of the united national remembrance of that origin of the land and of its belonging to God. Not for naught was the Keves ben Shana, the young of the flock appointed by God to be the eternal symbolic representation of his people in their relation to him. In our individual and national relation to God, we have no greater enemy than the change of our fresh, youthful enthusiasm of the consciousness of belonging to God to the worn-out, blasé condition of having grown old in the land of promise. When that which is promised was the longed-for goal of our hopes and wishing has become ours, and now we grow old in the possession of it. He's warning you, don't ever grow old, but not old as Zakein, but it has to be fresh, it has to be special, it has to be enthusiastic, so we appreciate it and understand this uniqueness and the special quality of Eretz Yisrael. And finally, we have an absolutely phenomenal idea from the Ksav Kabbalah. Okay, we read Parshas Kriyas Shema. The first Parsha of Shema is in Parshas Vesechanan. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And as we all know, that at the end of the Parsha, the Torah tells us, Ukshartam la'os al yadecha v'hayu l'totafos beinei necha. And they should be totafos, between your eyes. As we all know, that is referring to the tefillin sheberosh. The Ksav Kabbalah says something fascinating, something that you should hear and think about. Here he says as follows. L'Rabboseinu, he says, if you look to Chazal, and this is a Gemara in Menachos, and we all know this, all of us who wear tefillin. Beinei necha, when it says it should be between your eyes, it doesn't mean literally between your eyes, literally, but it means that kudkod. That means on your scalp, on your head, makom shetinok rofes, the place where the child's head is very soft. The omru hanosein tefillin shel rosh al mitzcho, if you put the tefillin shel rosh on your forehead, has hareza der hakaraim. That's what the Karaites did, who took the Torah literally, and it says beinei necha, so they put it between their eyes, either here or right here on their forehead, and that is a Karaite action. Hamevazim divrei chachamim, who despise the words of chachamim, v'holchen achrei hamashma, and they go after the literal interpretation, kimashmon beinei necha mamash, as it says in necha mamash. He says, but let's understand, why does the Torah say beinei necha? If it's not literal, if it doesn't mean beinei necha, then say it should be on your forehead. It should be up here. Why does it say beinei necha? Says the Ksava Kabbalah, an absolutely unbelievable idea. He says, based on Chazal, Masha Amra Torah beinei necha, the fact that the Torah said beinei necha, yesh lomar, he says, Lefisha gidei haros somchin v'yotzim min ha'etzem shel moach v'holchim b'his achdus b'tchila v'achar kach mischalkin atzmon uponim el hayomim v'asmol el shtei ha'enayim u'magiyim el toch ishan basoyin v'sham polim chush haraos v'al yodam nispasim amaros v'ham Mufshim el hamoach kisham beisam makarim b'sharsha. He says, in one's brain, in one's head, the ability to see wherever that part of your brain is, it comes together over here on the front lobe, and it goes down to your eye on this side, your eye on that side, and this is the place where they crisscross, where that word he uses was gidei haraos, the sinews, the veins, whatever the proper medical term is, that is part of the brain area up here on your head. Where is that found on your skull? That's right over here where the tefillin go. Okay? Kenoda mitchachmei hanituach, as he says, and he lived in the mid-19th century, as we know from Chachmei Hanituach, from surgeons. When it says beinei necha, it doesn't mean between the external eyes that everybody sees, that are revealed to everybody. It's the source of the eye, the ability of sight, the ability to see, which is not visible to the outside world, that's talking about our brain. V'sham ayin meshutaf laroso yoral eva haros, and that is the eva, the ability to see, your ability of sight. And he says that's where it's found on your skull. The yoral amaka v'shoresh, and it's talking about the source of our ability to have sight. Kamo eina mayim shumakar ha'mayim. The source of water is not the lake, it's found in its original source where you find it. It is the source of salvation, the source of light is where one puts his tefillin. It's the source of your ability to see, not beinei necha here, but beinei necha here, which is where the moach, the skull, in the brain matter, etc. That's where Rav Mecklenburg says is your area where sight is, or at least where it crisscrosses to come down to your eyes, and that's what it means. L'totavos beinei necha. Kerochav dalet etzbos mi'eschilas ikar sam and ametzach lamala. 4 finger lengths from the roots of the hair from your forehead and above. And that's what he says. That is an unbelievable shot by Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, Tzava Kabbalah. Parshas Vesechanan, Shabbos Nachamu, few very unbelievable and very meaningful thoughts for this Shabbos.